Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit a seed stitch bow in any size, any gauge, any yarn weight. So let's get started. So what you're going to need for this project is your knitting needles, a measuring tape, some scissors, a yarn needle, whatever kind you like, and some yarn. Now with this pattern, I'm not going to specify a particular weight or thickness of yarn or a particular needle size because you can totally choose what needle size you want to use and what yarn you want to use with this. So you can do this in any gauge, any size, any yarn, any needles, whatever. So I've got some sport weight yarn here, and when I say you can choose any yarn and any needles, I still do recommend that you choose a needle size that is appropriate for the thickness of the yarn you're using. So like, I wouldn't recommend using like a size 9 with sport weight yarn because you're going to get a really open fabric. That's not going to have very much structure to it because it's going to be full of holes because it'll be so loose. So pick a size needle. It doesn't matter what kind of needle it is, a straight needle, a circular needle, a double pointed needle, whatever, as long as you have, a left and a right needle. But just pick the yarn you want to use. I like a smooth yarn for this, but that's just me. You can use a textured yarn if you want. And the appropriately sized needle. I'm using a 16-inch circular, but if you want to use straight needles, go ahead. If you want to use double pointed needles, go ahead. It doesn't matter. And if you do use double pointed needles, you only need 2, because we're just going to be working back and forth. We're knitting a rectangle. So the measuring tape is to help you determine what size you want your bow to be. So I'm going to start with my yarn. I'm going to make a slip knot, and I'm not going to leave a super long tail, but I'm going to leave enough of one that I can cast on, because I'm going to use a long tail cast on. So you're going to cast on any even number of stitches. So anything 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Obviously you're not going to cast on 2 stitches and knit a bow out of that because that's tiny, no matter what size yarn you're using. But any even number of stitches onto your needle, and you just want to make it long enough that, because this is going to be your width. You're going to knit the length going this way, but this is going to be your width, the height, if you want to call it that. So I'm going to cast on an even number of stitches until I get about the correct width or height that I want for the bow that I'm making. And I'm just using a long tail cast on for this because it's simple and easy, and that's really all you need. It doesn't need anything fancy for this. If you want to do fancy, you can do fancy, but I want a straight edge, so I'm just doing a long tail. So just go ahead and measure your cast on and see if it's about the length that you want, because this cast on edge is going to be how wide or how tall your bow is. So I have about 2.5 inches right here. I've got 18 stitches on my needle. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start knitting in seed stitch, which is very simple. If you can knit 1 purl 1 ribbing, then you can knit seed stitch because it's very similar to a knit 1 purl 1 ribbing. So we're going to start by knitting 1 and purling 1, knitting 1 and purling 1, all the way across. Knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. Very simple until we get to the end of the row. And there's the first row. Now I'm going to turn it over. And as you can see, the first stitch is on this side is a knit stitch. So it would be, if I were doing a ribbing, I would do another row of knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. But because we're doing seed stitch, we're going to reverse it and do the opposite. We're going to do purl 1, knit 1 across the second row. Purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. And this is a very simple, beginner-friendly project. You can add this to another project as an embellishment if you like. And it's something pretty simple that a beginner knitter can do, because it's just, you cast on, you do knitting and purling, and then at the end you bind off, and then I'll show you how to finish it up when we get there. So there's my second row. So as you can see, the stitches have these little offset, zigzag of little bumps. Those are the purls. And the pearls that are lower, the bumps that are lower, are the pearls from the first row. So that's row 1 and row 2, and we're going to be repeating rows 1 and 2 over and over and over again until the bow is the length that we want it to be. So because the last row I did was purl 1, knit 1, which was row 2, now I'm going to go back and do row 1, which is knit 1, purl 1. So I'm going to keep repeating rows 1 and 2. Row 1 is knit 1, purl 1 across, and row 2 is purl 1, knit 1 across. And I'm going to keep repeating those 2 rows until the bow is the length that I want it to be. So I have finished the knitting part of the bow. I've got about 4 inches of length here. It's actually going to be length going this way because this is the direction it's going to go. And when you knit a bow, I kind of like to have a little bit more than half of the length as the width. So my bow is 4 inches long going this way, and I've made it 2.5 inches wide. So it's a little bit more than half of the length going this way. So now you can see the texture of the seed stitch here, and it's a beautiful texture. It's basically a checkerboard of knits and purls. So when you're working the seed stitch and you need to start a new row, the best way to tell which row you're supposed to do next is to look at the first stitch on the needle. The first stitch on my needle right now is a purl. So if I were to knit another row, then I would start with a knit stitch. I would knit the purl stitch and purl the knit stitch. Knit the purl stitch, purl the knit stitch. So we're doing a checkerboard here. So if the first stitch on my needle was a knit stitch, then I would purl it. So that's how you tell which row you're supposed to do next, but I'm done with the knitting. It's the length that I want it to be. So now what I'm going to do is bind off. And I'm just going to do a standard basic bind off like you would from any regular, this is the basic standard bind off for knitting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit the first stitch, knit the second stitch, pass the first stitch over the second one, knit the next stitch, pass the first stitch over the second one, knit the next stitch, pass the first stitch over the second one. So it's a very simple bind off and a very commonly used one. And so I'm going to just bind off all the way across. You don't want your bind off to be too tight because you don't want to shrink up this edge. Alright, last stitch. Pass the first stitch over the second one, and there's the end of my bind off. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the yarn, leaving about a 6-inch tail, and I'm going to pull that loop open a little bit, pull the tail through the loop to tie off. So I'm done with the needles, and because I'm going to be stitching this down to a project totally flat and the whole thing is going to be stitched down, then I'm not going to weave in these ends. I'm just going to weave them in slightly and tuck the rest underneath like that, because I'm going to be tacking it down to my project all the way around on all edges. But if you're going to be using this freestanding like a hair clip or on a headband or something, or any application where all edges are not going to be tacked down, then you would definitely go ahead and weave in these ends. So now you're going to grab your yarn needle. What I'm going to do is take each tail, and I'm not going to weave this in very securely because it's just a, kind of temporary to hold it behind the work. But it's not actually going to be real secure this way because I'm just going into the purl bumps just to get that tail out of the way so that it's behind the work when I go to tack it down to my project. And you can't see that at all on the front side, which is very important. So I'm just going to leave it like that, and I'm going to cut off most of the extra because the tails are not really going to be able to get out because I'm going to stitch the whole edge of the bow down. So I'm going to do the same thing with this tail. So that's what the back of my bow looks like with the ends tucked in. And here's the front. So just give a little tug on those corners to make sure that they're sharp. And now we're going to take the yarn that's coming from the ball and we're going to use it to cinch the center part of this bow closed. So what I like to do when I'm doing a bow is I like to tuck the center like that so that it's very neat on both sides as opposed to just squishing it. Because if you just squish it, then it's going to be a little bit messy. So I'm going to take my yarn needle and put it onto that working yarn. I'm going to give about a yard of yarn to work with and cut it off of the ball. So now what I'm going to do is you're going to find the center. You're going to measure where the center is. So since mine is 4 inches wide, then the center will be at 2 inches. So if this is my center right here, I'm going to take a couple of little tucks. I'm going to pinch at the center. I like to take 3. And you want to make them pretty even. Like so. That's what the back looks like. And I'm going to take my yarn needle and just go up through the center of that. And pull until I've used up most of the length of my yarn. I'm going to leave a bit of a tail like that. Then I'm going to lay it down again. And I'm going to stitch going back through it again. Like so. And one more time going back up. And then we'll just pull on both ends. And then what I'm going to do is turn it over and take the tail and tie it together with the yarn that's attached to my yarn needle. And you do want to make it kind of tight. I'm just going to tie mine in a double knot, like so. Just give it a little tug to make sure that it's not twisted or anything. And as you can see, when you do the actual stitching through, it's probably going to end up a little bit off the center, but we're going to fix that with how we wrap it. So what we're going to do is I like to hold my tail yarn out of the way, and we're just going to take the yarn on the yarn needle and wrap it around the center of the bow, like that. And the more you wrap it, the thicker the center part is going to be. So just keep wrapping it around the middle until you are happy with the way it looks. And I'm happy with that as far as it being on center, but I like it to be a little bit wider, bulkier around the middle. So I'm just going to use up whatever is left, almost all of what's left of my yarn. I want to make sure that it's wrapped around evenly. There's no lumps. And so that is almost all my yarn, and it is pretty even across both sides here. So I'm going to take the yarn that's on my needle, and I'm going to turn it over and tie it together again with the tail. And then I like to take this yarn and kind of take a couple of stitches through that wrapped yarn. Like so. And then I like to take another knot. And then I can just slip that yarn underneath all that wrapped yarn to secure it. And because what I have left is not really enough to stitch it down with, I'm just going to trim the end. And I'm also going to slip the other end of the tail underneath that wrapped yarn. And then when I go to stitch it down, then I will use a new piece of yarn that is the proper length for going down all the way around the edges of the bow. So there's my finished bow. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you make this project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching. Bye.